I was 34 years old when my boss handed me a mop, pointed at the executive bathroom on the fourth floor, and told me that if I couldn't handle the small tasks, I had no business asking for a promotion. So I cleaned the bathroom. I scrubbed every surface, restocked the hand towels, made the whole room spotless. Then I walked back to my desk, sat down and said nothing. That was a Friday. The following Monday morning, my boss arrived at the office to find a letter waiting on his desk. Not a resignation. Not a complaint filed with HR. A notification from the company's parent holding group informing him that effective immediately, the controlling interest of the firm had transferred to a new owner. My name was on that letter. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the previous 14 months quietly doing something nobody in that building thought someone like me was capable of doing. And by the time he handed me that mop, the deal was already done. He just didn't know it yet. Let me take you back to where this really starts. Callaway Integrated Solutions was a mid-size logistics consulting firm in downtown Atlanta. 83 employees, 4 floors, a client roster that included 3 Fortune 500 companies, and an internal culture that operated like a medieval hierarchy with better coffee. I joined as a senior financial analyst 6 years before the Monday with the letter. I came in with a master's degree in finance, 4 years of experience at a Big Four accounting firm, and a track record that my previous supervisor had described in my reference letter as, and I'm quoting directly, the most precise analytical mind I have encountered in 20 years of practice. I say that not to impress you. I say it because you need to understand the gap between what I brought to that company and what that company decided I was worth. My name is Celeste Waring. And from the day I walked through Callaway's glass doors, I was quietly, consistently, and very deliberately underestimated. My boss was a man named Marcus Holt, Regional Director of Operations, 15 years at the company, the kind of man who filled a room with his certainty before he'd finished walking into it. Marcus had an MBA from a state school he mentioned in approximately 1 out of every 3 conversations, a firm handshake he deployed like punctuation, and an instinct for identifying which people he could safely dismiss. He identified me within the first week. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, the way the most effective dismissals always are. He'd redirect my contributions in meetings, not disagree with them, just absorb them into the conversation and restate them in his own words without attribution. He'd assign me projects below my skill level, then express faint surprise when I completed them quickly, as though speed itself was suspicious. He gave my most visible work to a junior analyst named Brandon, affable, loud, and exactly the kind of person Marcus understood, and let Brandon present it to senior leadership. Brandon was good at his job. I want to be fair about that. But Brandon was presenting my frameworks and my numbers, and both of us knew it, and only one of us seemed bothered. The rest of the office existed in 2 distinct categories. The people Marcus groomed for visibility, and the people he considered infrastructure. Functional, necessary, unremarkable. The people who kept the engine running while the people he'd chosen collected the credit. I was infrastructure. My colleague Deja, brilliant, sharp, 6 years at the firm, was infrastructure. Our IT manager Raymond, who had single-handedly rebuilt the company's data architecture over an 18-month period, was infrastructure. We were the people whose names didn't appear in the all-hands presentations, whose budget requests got tabled, whose promotion applications disappeared into a review process that somehow never concluded. I applied for the Director of Financial Strategy position twice in 3 years. The first time I was told the role had been restructured and was no longer available. 3 months later it was reposted with a slightly different title. I applied again. This time Marcus told me directly in a one-on-one meeting that I needed to demonstrate more leadership presence before I'd be considered for a senior role. I asked him what that meant specifically. He said, presence. Executive energy. The ability to command a room. I asked what concrete steps I could take to demonstrate that. He looked at me for a moment and then said, sometimes it's less about steps and more about qualities. I wrote that down in my notebook when I got back to my desk. Not out of anger. Out of precision. I wanted the exact words on paper so I couldn't soften them later and talk myself into a more generous interpretation. Sometimes it's less about steps and more about qualities. What Marcus meant, translated out of corporate language into plain English, was that I didn't look like what he thought leadership looked like. My degrees didn't change that. My track record didn't change that. My precision and my output and my 6 years of institutional knowledge didn't change that. In Marcus Holt's framework, I was infrastructure. And infrastructure didn't get promoted. It got maintained. What Marcus never considered, not once in 6 years, not on the Friday he handed me a mop, not even in the weeks before the Monday with the letter, was that infrastructure, if it's load-bearing enough, can also be acquired. And I had spent 14 months figuring out exactly how to do that. The mop wasn't the beginning. I want to make that clear. The mop was the end of something. The last entry in a long ledger of small indignities that had been accumulating for 6 years with the patience and consistency of compound interest. By the time Marcus Holt pointed at the executive bathroom and handed me a cleaning implement, I had already made my decision, signed the relevant documents and transferred the relevant funds. The mop was almost beside the point. But it was also exactly the point. Because it told me everything I needed to know about how completely and how permanently Marcus had decided who I was. Let me take you back to the beginning of that final year. Because the mop doesn't make sense without the context that preceded it, and the context is where the real story lives. It started with the Meridian account. Meridian Logistics was Callaway's largest client. A national freight coordination company with distribution networks across 11 states. Annual contract value of approximately $4.2 million, and a relationship with Callaway that had been managed technically by Marcus's team for 9 years. I say technically because the actual analytical work, the modeling, the forecasting, the quarterly performance reviews, the annual strategic recommendations, had been produced almost entirely by my department for the past 4 of those 9 years. Marcus managed the relationship. We built everything he brought to it. In March of that final year, Meridian's CFO, a woman named Patricia Osei, reached out directly to our department. Not through Marcus, not through the standard account management channel. Directly to me by email with a specific request. Meridian was considering a significant operational restructuring and wanted an independent analysis of 3 potential logistics models before they committed to a direction. Patricia had apparently reviewed the previous 4 years of our strategic recommendations and identified, in her words, a consistent analytical voice that I'd like to engage directly on this project. That analytical voice was mine. I went to Marcus immediately. I showed him the email. I explained what Patricia was requesting. I told him I thought this was an opportunity to deepen the Meridian relationship and I wanted his guidance on how to proceed. What I expected was acknowledgement. A conversation about approach. Maybe even enthusiasm, given the revenue implications of a strengthened client relationship. What I got was a 20-minute lecture about account management protocol. Marcus explained at length and with the careful patience of a man who considered himself to be performing a mentorship, that client relationships existed at the relationship manager level. That direct contact between analytical staff and client executives created confusion about ownership and accountability. That Patricia's email, while flattering, was the kind of thing that needed to be redirected through proper channels to avoid setting a problematic precedent. He would respond to Patricia himself. He would explain that the analysis she was requesting would be handled by the team. He would position it as a collaborative engagement managed from his office. I asked if I would be involved in the analysis. He said, of course. That's your job. I asked if my involvement would be communicated to Patricia directly. He looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for questions he considered naive. Celeste, she doesn't need to know the internal staffing. She needs to know Callaway is handling her request. I went back to my desk and produced the analysis over the following 3 weeks. 3 comprehensive models, 67 pages of supporting documentation, scenario forecasting across 5 economic conditions, sensitivity analysis, risk-adjusted recommendations with confidence intervals. I worked 12-hour days. I came in on 2 consecutive weekends. Marcus presented it to Patricia in a client meeting I was not invited to attend. The feedback from Patricia, relayed to me by Marcus in a subsequent one-on-one, was that the analysis was exceptional. That it was exactly what Meridian needed to move forward with confidence. That Callaway had demonstrated once again why they were the right firm for the engagement. Marcus delivered this feedback with the warmth of someone reporting good news that belonged to both of them. I said, "Thank you for letting me know." He said, "Great work on this one. This is the kind of contribution that gets noticed." I wrote that down too. Right beneath the qualities entry from the year before. This is the kind of contribution that gets noticed. It was noticed by Patricia Osei. It was noticed by Meridian. It was not noticed in any formal, documented, career-affecting way within Callaway Integrated Solutions. My performance review that quarter described my output as consistently solid. Brandon, who had contributed a single slide deck to the Meridian project, received a bonus. I did not. I didn't raise it. I want you to understand that I chose not to raise it. Not because I was afraid, not because I lacked the language, but because I had already started doing the math on something else entirely, and escalating a grievance inside the company was not part of the calculation. The calculation had started the previous November, 5 months before the Meridian project, during a routine piece of research that had nothing to do with Callaway specifically and everything to do with the industry broadly. I had been running an analysis on consolidation trends in mid-market logistics consulting as part of a personal project. The kind of research I did in evenings and on weekends because I was genuinely interested in the sector and because keeping my thinking sharp outside the narrow confines of my assigned work felt necessary for my sanity. What I found was interesting. Callaway Integrated Solutions was majority-owned by a holding company called ArcBridge Capital Partners. ArcBridge was a private equity firm that had acquired Callaway 7 years ago as part of a portfolio of mid-market professional services firms. Their standard acquisition model involved a 5 to 7 year hold period, operational improvement, and then either a sale to a strategic buyer or a secondary PE transaction. Callaway was in year 7. I pulled ArcBridge's publicly available filings and their investor communications. The language in their most recent annual report was the specific language PE firms use when they're preparing an asset for exit. Operational maturity. Positioned for next stage growth. Seeking appropriate strategic partnership. Translated, they were getting ready to sell. I sat with that information for 3 days. Then I started making calls. Not to anyone at Callaway. Not to anyone at ArcBridge. To people I knew from my Big 4 years, from my graduate program, from 4 years of building relationships in the financial services world, because I understood, even before I could articulate it clearly, that relationships were a form of capital and I was going to need capital eventually. The first call was to a woman named Simone Achebe. We had worked together at the accounting firm 7 years prior. She had since moved into private credit, was now a managing director at a boutique investment firm that structured acquisition financing for management buyouts and strategic acquisitions in the professional services space. I told her I had something I wanted to talk through. Hypothetically. She said she had an hour on Thursday. We talked for 3 hours. The structure Simone described was not simple. But it was not impossible either. A management buyout, or in this case, a partial acquisition by a single buyer without existing management participation, required a combination of equity capital and debt financing. The equity component could come from personal funds, outside investors, or both. The debt component would be structured against the acquired company's future cash flows. The key variables were the acquisition price, the quality of Callaway's financials, the stability of its client relationships, and the buyer's ability to demonstrate operational understanding of the business. I knew Callaway's financials better than anyone in the building except possibly the CFO, and our CFO, A quiet and thorough man named Gerald Park had been passed over for promotion twice in 4 years and was, I had reason to believe, not feeling particularly loyal to the current leadership structure. I knew the client relationships intimately because I had been doing the analytical work that sustained them for 6 years. I understood the operational structure because infrastructure always understands the building better than the people who live in the visible rooms. Over the following 8 months, I did 4 things simultaneously. First, I built the financial model. A complete acquisition analysis. Callaway's revenue, EBITDA, client concentration risk, staff retention risk, competitive positioning, growth potential under different operational scenarios. I worked on it at home, on a personal laptop, on a separate network. I told no one at Callaway what I was doing. Second, I cultivated the financing relationships. Simone connected me with 2 additional lenders. I had 17 conversations over 6 months. I was declined twice, asked for additional documentation repeatedly, and required to produce a level of financial and operational detail that would have been impossible for anyone who hadn't spent 6 years inside the company. The depth of my knowledge was, in a direct and specific way, the product of 6 years of being underestimated and therefore left alone to do the actual work without interference. Third, I quietly approached Gerald Park. This was the most delicate part of the entire process. Gerald was not a risk-taker. He was precise, careful, and deeply private. I did not tell him I was pursuing an acquisition. I told him I was doing some consulting work on the side related to mid-market professional services consolidation, and I wanted his perspective on certain financial structures. We had 3 conversations over 2 months. In the 3rd conversation, I showed him the model. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me. Then he looked at the model again. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. 8 months. "Does anyone here know?" "No." Another long silence. "The client retention assumptions on page 12, he said finally. "You're being conservative on Meridian. Patricia Osei specifically requested your work by name 6 months ago. That relationship is stronger than this model reflects." He was right. And the fact that he said it, the fact that his first response to seeing what I had built was to help me make it more accurate, told me everything I needed to know about Gerald Park. "Would you be willing to consult on the financing process?" I asked. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. He said, "I would." Fourth and finally, I contacted ArcBridge directly. Not through a broker. Not through an intermediary. I wrote a letter to their managing partner, a man named David Okafor, outlining my interest in acquiring the controlling interest of Callaway Integrated Solutions. I attached a 22-page summary of my analytical framework, my financing structure, and my operational plan for the company post-acquisition. I sent it from a personal email address on a Sunday evening in January. David Okafor responded on Tuesday morning. "Ms. Waring, this is an unusually well-constructed approach document. I'd like to schedule a call." We scheduled the call. The call became a meeting. The meeting became a process that lasted 4 months, involved 3 rounds of due diligence, 2 financing revisions, 1 near collapse when a lender withdrew and Simone spent 11 days finding a replacement, and a final negotiation session that ran from 9 in the morning until past midnight. The deal closed on a Thursday. The following morning, Marcus Holt handed me a mop. And I cleaned the bathroom. Every surface spotless. Because I had decided years ago that the work in front of me was always worth doing well regardless of what it was or who was watching. That precision wasn't something you switched on for important moments. It was something you maintained as a practice. Also, honestly, I wanted to remember it. The specific feeling of standing in that bathroom with a mop in my hand, knowing what was sitting in an envelope on Marcus Holt's desk 1 floor above me. I wanted to have that memory intact and uncomplicated for the rest of my life. It took me 11 minutes to clean the bathroom. Then I washed my hands, straightened my jacket, and went back to my desk to wait for Monday morning. Monday morning arrived the way consequential mornings often do. Quietly, unremarkably, indistinguishable on the surface from any other Monday. I was at my desk by 7:45. Earlier than usual but not dramatically so. I'd been careful throughout the entire 14-month process to maintain the precise rhythms of my ordinary working life. Same arrival times, same lunch patterns, same measured participation in meetings. The discipline of appearing unchanged while everything was changing had required a specific kind of sustained attention that I think only people who have spent years being underestimated truly understand. When you've been rendered invisible by someone's assumptions, you learn to inhabit that invisibility strategically. I made coffee in the fourth-floor break room. Exchanged a brief good morning with Raymond from IT, who arrived early every Monday to run system checks before the building filled. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. I pulled up a spreadsheet I'd been working on the previous week and looked at it without seeing it. At 8:17 I heard the elevator. Marcus Holt had a specific sound when he arrived. Not loud, he wasn't a loud man, noise wasn't his particular instrument. It was more the quality of displaced air, the sense of a presence that had decided in advance that the space it was entering belonged to it. Footsteps with a particular cadence. The click of his key card against his office door. Then silence. The silence lasted longer than it should have. A normal Monday morning silence in Marcus's office lasted approximately 45 seconds. Enough time for him to set down his bag, remove his jacket, check his phone, and begin the process of arranging his day. I knew this the way you know the rhythms of any environment you've inhabited for 6 years. The building had a pulse and I had learned it completely. The silence that morning lasted 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock in the corner of my laptop screen without moving. At 8:21 his office door opened. He appeared in the doorway of the open floor plan, letter in hand, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen from him in 6 years. Not anger. Anger would come later. Not confusion exactly. Something more specific than either of those. The expression of a man who has just encountered information that his existing framework has no category for. He stood there for a moment. His eyes moved across the floor until they found me. I looked up from my screen with the measured neutrality I had been practicing for months. Celeste. His voice was controlled. Careful. Can you come into my office? Of course, I said. I saved the spreadsheet, picked up my notebook and followed him. His office was a corner room on the 4th floor with windows on 2 sides and a view of the downtown Atlanta skyline that he had mentioned. Across 6 years in various contexts, approximately 40 times. The desk was large and deliberately imposing. Behind it, on a credenza, sat a framed photo of Marcus shaking hands with the mayor at some civic function, a small collection of industry awards, and a baseball signed by a player whose name I'd never been able to read clearly from my usual position across the desk. He closed the door. He did not sit down. He stood behind his desk holding the letter from Arkbridge Capital Partners and looked at me with the careful expression of someone managing a situation they don't yet fully understand. I received this morning, he said. I know, I said. I arranged for it to be delivered. Pause. This says you've acquired controlling interest in Callaway. 58%, I said. The remaining 42% is held by 2 minority partners. The acquisition closed Thursday. He set the letter on his desk. His hands were steady. I'll give him that. How? It wasn't quite a question. It was the word of a man trying to locate the beginning of something he didn't understand. I've been working on the financing structure for 14 months, I said. Arkbridge was preparing to exit their position. I approached them directly with an acquisition proposal in January. We went through 4 months of due diligence and closed last week. You're a financial analyst. He said it the way people say things that are technically true but functionally inadequate. I'm the person who built every major financial model this company has produced for the last 4 years, I said. Which means I understood the company's value better than almost anyone else in the building. That understanding was the foundation of the acquisition thesis. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of a man processing unexpected news. The silence of a man beginning to recalibrate an entire framework. You should have told me, he said. I looked at him steadily. Why? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Because the honest answer, and Marcus was smart enough to know the honest answer, was that there was no version of I should have told him that held up under examination. If I had told him I was pursuing an acquisition of the company he managed, he would have had me removed. He would have characterized it as a conflict of interest, a breach of professional ethics, a destabilizing action. He would have called Arkbridge himself and attempted to poison the process. And he would have done all of those things not because they were right but because the alternative, a financial analyst he'd handed a mop on a Friday becoming his employer by Monday, was a reorganization of the world that his framework could not accommodate. He didn't answer the question. Instead he said, "What does this mean for my position?" And here is where I want to be precise because I think precision matters more than drama in moments like this one. I had thought carefully about this question long before Monday morning. I had thought about it during the due diligence process, during the financing negotiations, during the 11 days when the deal nearly collapsed and I had to decide whether I was willing to restructure the financing terms to keep it alive. I had thought about what kind of owner I intended to be and what kind of decisions that required. The answer I had arrived at was not the answer Marcus expected. I could see that clearly from the way he held himself while he waited for it. The slight forward lean, the prepared resistance. "Your position is under review," I said. "Along with several other senior roles. That's standard in any ownership transition. Gerald Park will be managing the operational continuity process. You'll hear from him this week with a formal timeline." Gerald Park, Marcus repeated. The name landed with particular weight because Gerald was a person Marcus had spent 4 years treating as a background figure. A numbers person. Infrastructure. "Gerald has agreed to serve as interim COO during the transition," I said. "He has a comprehensive understanding of the company's financial and operational structure." Marcus looked at me for a long moment. "You've been planning this with Gerald." "Gerald provided consultation on the financial modeling," I said. "His involvement was professional and entirely appropriate." "How long?" "Several months." Another silence. Outside the windows, Atlanta was doing its Monday morning things. Traffic on Peachtree, a construction crane turning slowly against the sky, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know or care about what was happening on the 4th floor of this particular building. "I want to understand something," Marcus said. His voice had shifted. The management register was gone. What remained was something more unguarded. The Meridian analysis. The Hargrove restructuring. The operational framework we presented to the board in September. "All of that was yours." "Yes." "And I positioned it as the team's work," I said. "Yes." He sat down behind his desk. It was the first time in 6 years I had seen Marcus Holt sit down at the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. "I didn't think of it as," he stopped. "You didn't think of it as anything in particular," I said. "That's the point. It didn't require a decision. It was simply the natural order of things as you understood them." He looked at the letter on his desk. "I told you the promotion required executive presence. You told me it required qualities," I said. "Not steps. Qualities." He flinched. Barely. Just a slight contraction around the eyes. But I saw it. "I want to be clear about something," I said. "I'm not here to have a conversation about the last 6 years. I'm here because you needed to receive this information directly from me rather than through intermediaries. The professional matters, your role, the transition structure, the new reporting relationships, will be handled through proper channels by the appropriate people." "Proper channels," he repeated. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the specific effort of a man reaching for something that doesn't come naturally to him. "The mop. On Friday. I cleaned the bathroom," I said. "It needed cleaning. I had known." "You wouldn't have done it differently," I said. "Not harshly. Just precisely. That's the thing you need to sit with, Marcus. Not what you would have done if you'd known. What it tells you that you did it without knowing." I stood up. I picked up my notebook. "Gerald will be in touch this week," I said. "I'd encourage you to engage with that process seriously. I left his office, pulled the door closed behind me with the soft, deliberate click of someone who has nothing left to prove, and walked back across the open floor to my desk. What happened in the building over the following hours is worth describing because it moved the way information always moves in an office. Not in a straight line but in a ripple pattern, touching different people at different moments with different impact. Gerald had received his own formal notification at 8 that morning, confirming his interim COO appointment and the transition timeline. We had agreed in advance that he would make himself available in his office for anyone who needed to speak with him, and that he would say nothing beyond what was in the official documentation until I was ready to address the full staff. Deja found me at my desk at 10:30. She sat in the chair across from me without being invited and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone revising a large amount of previously held information simultaneously. "Gerald just told me," she said. "I know," I said. "You bought the company. Controlling interest." "Celeste." She leaned forward. "What? Thursday. And the mop. Friday." She stared at me. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh or a surprised laugh, but a full, genuine, slightly incredulous laugh that she pressed the back of her hand against to contain. "You cleaned the bathroom," she said. "It needed cleaning. You cleaned the bathroom knowing." "I clean things thoroughly when they need cleaning," I said. "That hasn't changed." She shook her head slowly. "How long have you been working on this?" 14 months. "And you didn't tell me." I looked at her. Deja and I had worked together for 5 years. She was the person I trusted most in the building and the one whose professional judgment I respected most completely. Not telling her had been one of the most difficult discipline choices of the entire process. "I couldn't tell anyone," I said. "The risk of disclosure was too significant. If it had reached Marcus before the closing." "I know," she said. "I understand. I'm not upset." She paused. "Actually, I'm a little upset. But mostly She stopped again, searching for the word. "Relieved?" I offered. She looked at me steadily. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, that's exactly it. I need people I trust in the right positions," I said. "I'd like to talk to you properly this week about what that looks like." She nodded. Quiet for a moment. Then, "Does Patricia say no yet?" "I'm calling her this afternoon. She's going to be pleased." Deja paused. "She asked about you specifically, you know. After the meridian analysis. She asked Marcus who had done the modeling. He told her it was a team effort." "I know." She didn't believe him. I looked up from my desk. "How do you know that?" "Because she called me," Deja said simply. "Privately. 3 weeks after the presentation. She said she recognized a specific analytical approach across 4 years of deliverables and she wanted to know who was behind it." Pause. I told her. I sat with that for a moment. Patricia Osei had known for months. She had reached out directly, not as a client fishing for better service but as a professional who had correctly identified where the actual work was coming from and had gone looking for the source. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because she asked me not to," Deja said. "She said she was going to handle it directly." A slight smile. I think this might be what she meant. I called Patricia Osei at 2 o'clock. She picked up on the second ring. "Celeste," she said. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." "You knew?" I asked. "I knew something was happening," she said. "David Okafor and I are on a nonprofit board together. He mentioned 3 months ago that ArcBridge had received an unusually well-constructed acquisition approach from someone inside Callaway. He didn't name you. But I had a reasonable hypothesis. You didn't say anything. It wasn't my process to interfere with," she said. "If you were building something, the last thing you needed was me calling Marcus Holt to ask questions." Pause. "Is the Meridian relationship still intact under the new ownership structure?" "It's one of my highest priorities," I said. "Good," she said. "Because I'd like to formalize what should have been formalized 2 years ago. Direct engagement between my team and yours. No intermediary layer. I'll have something drafted for you by end of week." I expected nothing less, she said. And there was warmth in it. The warmth of someone who had been paying attention for a long time and was relieved to finally be in a conversation that reflected the actual reality of things. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, we had the outline of a restructured engagement that represented, conservatively, a 30% increase in the annual contract value. I wrote the number in my notebook and sat quietly with it for a moment. 6 years of invisible work. 14 months of disciplined preparation. 11 minutes with a mop. And a Monday morning that rearranged everything. I looked across the open floor at the building I now owned. At Raymond in IT running his afternoon checks. At Deja at her desk reviewing something with the focused intensity she brought to everything. At Gerald Park's office door, slightly ajar, the lamp inside casting a warm rectangle of light across the floor. Infrastructure, I thought. Load-bearing. And then I went back to work. The all-staff meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 10. I had debated the timing carefully. Monday had been necessary for the direct conversations. Marcus, Gerald, Deja, Patricia. Tuesday had been operational. Calls with ArcBridge's transition team. A meeting with the outside counsel handling the ownership documentation. A 2-hour session with Gerald mapping the immediate structural priorities. Wednesday was for everyone else. 83 employees. 4 floors. People who had come to work every day for years inside a building whose ownership had just changed hands without their knowledge, and who deserved to hear what that meant for them from the person responsible. I had written and rewritten the opening remarks 6 times over the previous 2 weeks. Not because I was nervous about speaking. I had presented to boards and senior leadership and difficult clients for years without difficulty. But because the words mattered in a specific way that most presentations don't. These were people's livelihoods. Their routines, their stability, their professional identities. Whatever I said in that room would become the foundation on which they decided whether to stay or go, whether to trust or resist, whether the change represented opportunity or threat. I owed them precision. Not performance. Gerald and I arrived together at 9:45. The main conference room on the 3rd floor had been arranged with chairs in a semicircle rather than classroom rows. Gerald's suggestion, and a good one. Rows create an audience. A semicircle creates a conversation. People filtered in over the next 15 minutes. I watched them arrive. The specific social choreography of an office gathering where the news is significant and not yet fully understood. Small clusters forming and dissolving. Voices lower than usual. The particular alertness of people who have heard enough to know something real is happening but not enough to know what it means for them specifically. Marcus was not present. He had submitted a formal leave request Tuesday morning. Gerald had approved it without comment. His absence was noted by everyone in the room and addressed by no one aloud, which is how offices process the removal of a dominant personality, in the space around his name rather than in the name itself. At 10 o'clock I stood up. The room went quiet with a speed that told me the attention had been waiting, coiled, ready to focus the moment there was something to focus on. "Good morning," I said. "My name is Celeste Waring. Most of you know me as a senior financial analyst on the 4th floor. As of last Thursday, I'm also the majority owner of Callaway Integrated Solutions. I want to talk to you directly about what that means." I paused. Let the sentence settle. The faces in the room were doing the specific work of people receiving information that doesn't fit their existing categories. I saw it move through the room in sequence. The initial processing, the quick mental arithmetic of implications, the glance toward colleagues to calibrate reaction. A project manager named Dennis, 15 years at the company, large and generally unflappable, said quietly from the 3rd row, "You bought the company." "Controlling interest," I said. 58%. "The acquisition closed last Thursday." "How?" he said. "Not challenging. Just genuinely needing the shape of it." "I'll get to that," I said. "But first I want to tell you what isn't changing because I think that's what most of you need to hear before anything else." I had learned this from Gerald during our early conversations about transition management. Before people can hear what's new, they need to know what's safe. The instinct to lead with vision is understandable but frequently wrong. Lead with stability. Then earn the right to talk about change. Your positions are not being eliminated, I said. Your compensation structures are not being reduced. Your existing contracts and agreements remain in force. The company is not being restructured for a sale. I did not acquire Callaway to extract value and exit. I acquired it to run it. I watched the room breathe. What is changing, I continued, is how decisions get made and who makes them. Gerald Park will be serving as interim CEO. Deja Simmons will be moving into a newly created role as Director of Client Strategy. Both of those appointments are effective immediately. Deja, seated to my left, had known since Tuesday morning. She kept her expression composed with the effort of someone who had been practicing composure for years and was very good at it. But I saw the slight straightening in her posture that she couldn't fully contain. Raymond from IT started clapping. Not performatively. A single, genuine, two-handed clap that he stopped almost immediately when he realized he was the only one. Then Dennis joined him. Then 3 more people. Then the room. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something more considered than that. The applause of people who had been waiting a long time for a specific kind of acknowledgement and were expressing relief as much as celebration. I want to address something directly, I said when the room settled. Because I think not addressing it would be a disrespect to your intelligence. The quality of attention shifted. People leaned slightly forward. Many of you have worked alongside me for years. You've seen my work. Some of you have watched that work be presented without my name attached to it. Some of you have been in similar positions yourselves, doing work that mattered, building things that held this company together, and watching the credit flow in other directions. The room was very still. That changes, I said. Not as a statement of grievance. As a statement of operational principle. Work will be attributed accurately. Contributions will be recognized structurally, not just personally. Promotion pathways will be built on documented output and demonstrated capability. Not on qualities. I let that last word land with its full weight. Several people in the room understood exactly what I meant by it, and I could see the understanding move across their faces like a change in light. A woman named Carol, a senior project coordinator who had been at Callaway for 11 years and who I knew had been passed over for advancement 3 times, raised her hand. As I said, the Hargrove restructuring framework, she said. The one that got presented to the board in September. I helped build that. Me and Deja and you. Marcus presented it. I know, I said. Is that, she paused, choosing words carefully. Is there going to be a record? Something that acknowledges what actually happened on those projects? As I said, Gerald and I are building a retroactive contribution audit for all major client deliverables from the past 4 years. It will be documented formally and it will inform compensation adjustments where appropriate. Carol nodded once. Fully. The nod of someone filing something important. Compensation adjustments, Dennis said from the 3rd row. Where the audit identifies significant contribution that was not reflected in existing compensation structures, I said, corrections will be made. I expect that process to be complete within 60 days. The room absorbed that. I want to be honest about something here. I had rehearsed this part of the presentation more than any other, because it was the part most vulnerable to sounding like performance. Like a new owner making promises designed to manufacture loyalty rather than earn it. The difference between those 2 things is specificity and follow-through, and I could only deliver one of them in the room that Wednesday morning. What I could offer was the specific. 60 days. Documented audit. Formal corrections. Not things will be better. But here is the process, here is the timeline, here's what better actually looks like. A hand went up near the back. A young analyst named Kevin who had joined the company 8 months prior and who I knew had been quietly exceptional in his first year without receiving any particular acknowledgement. What about new business development? He asked. The client expansion you mentioned, is that something the analytical team will be involved in directly? The analytical team, I said, is the primary driver of client value at this company. That's always been true. Going forward it will be visible. I looked at him directly. If you have ideas about where Callaway should be pursuing new business, I want to hear them. Formally. There will be a process for that. He nodded. Something in his posture changed. The specific postural shift of someone who has just been told that the thing they'd stopped believing was possible might actually be possible. I recognized it because I'd felt it myself. Once, a long time ago, and then again 14 months ago when David Okafor responded to my letter on a Tuesday morning. At 10:45 I opened the floor completely. What followed was 40 minutes of questions that ranged from the logistical, benefits administration, reporting structures, client communication protocols, to the more personal. A woman named Teresa asked whether I planned to keep the company independent or pursue mergers. A man named Patrick asked about the timeline for replacing Marcus's role formally. Raymond from IT asked, with characteristic directness, whether the server infrastructure budget was going to remain as inadequate as it had been for the past 3 years. That last question got a laugh from the room. Raymond, I said, send me a detailed proposal by Friday. I've had one ready for 2 years, he said. I know, I said. Send it anyway. The meeting ended just before noon. People dispersed slowly, in the particular way of a group that has received significant information and needs time to process it in smaller configurations. Clusters formed in the hallway by the elevators at the coffee station. Voices at a different register than 2 hours earlier. Something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. Not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly. The way air shifts before rain. Deja found me as I was gathering my notes. Carol's been here 11 years, she said quietly. I know. She hasn't had a meaningful raise in 4 of them. The audit will reflect that. Deja was quiet for a moment. You know what the hardest part of this morning was for me? What? Watching people's faces when you said their work would be attributed accurately. She paused. The relief. I wasn't prepared for how much relief was in this room. I thought about that. About 6 years of invisible work. About the specific weight of doing something well and watching the recognition travel to someone else. About the cumulative effect of that, across years, across an entire building full of people who had learned to manage their expectations downward. It shouldn't have required a ownership change, I said. No, Deja agreed. It shouldn't have. We stood there for a moment in the emptying conference room, the Atlanta skyline visible through the windows, the ordinary Wednesday afternoon sounds of the city coming through the glass. Gerald needs us in 20 minutes, I said. I know. Deja picked up her notebook. Celeste. Yeah. The mop, she said. On Friday. You really just cleaned the bathroom, I said. Yes. She shook her head slowly. I'm going to think about that for a very long time. Me too, I said honestly. Me too. Marcus Holt submitted his formal resignation on a Thursday, 11 days after the Monday with the letter. It arrived in Gerald's inbox at 6:47 in the morning, before most of the building was staffed. 2 paragraphs. Professional in tone, specific about the notice period, devoid of anything that resembled either accountability or bitterness. The letter of a man who had decided that dignified exit was the only remaining form of control available to him and was exercising it with precision. Gerald forwarded it to me with a single line. Received. No response required from you unless you want to. I didn't want to. I read it once, filed it in the appropriate folder, and went back to the operational review I'd been working on since 5:30. There was nothing in Marcus's resignation letter that required my emotional engagement. The situation had resolved itself through proper channels exactly as I'd told him it would, and the appropriate response was to allow that resolution to stand without ceremony. What I felt, sitting at my desk in the early morning quiet of a building I now owned, was not triumph. I want to be honest about that because I think the cleaner, more satisfying version of this story wants triumph here. Wants me to describe some private moment of vindication, some internal reckoning with 6 years of invisible work finally made visible. What I actually felt was focused, oriented toward what came next. The acquisition had closed, the transition was underway, and there was a company to run. That was where my attention belonged. The work was always the point. It still was. The fallout from the transition distributed itself across the organization in the weeks that followed in ways both expected and surprising. 3 of the 5 people Marcus had positioned as his inner circle, the ones he'd groomed for visibility, the ones whose careers had been built on proximity to his approval rather than depth of demonstrated capability, submitted their resignations within the first month. I didn't pursue any of them. The transition had created clarity about what Callaway would value going forward. And for people whose professional identities were built around a different value system, that clarity was naturally displacing. I wished them well through Gerald and moved on. What I didn't anticipate was Brandon. Brandon, the junior analyst who had spent 2 years presenting my frameworks to senior leadership, appeared in my office doorway on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks into the transition period. He knocked twice, waited to be acknowledged, and entered with the careful body language of someone who has rehearsed an approach and is executing it under significant personal stress. He sat down across from me. He placed both hands flat on his knees. He looked at me directly. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. "Probably more than that. But I'll start there." I put down my pen and gave him my full attention. "The Meridian analysis," he said. "The Hargrove framework. The board presentation. I presented your work. Not because I was ordered to," Marcus suggested it, "but I could have pushed back. I didn't push back because it was easier not to and because," he paused, "because I told myself it was just how things worked here. That it wasn't personal." "It wasn't personal," I said. "But it also wasn't right." "Oh," he agreed. "It wasn't right." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I'm good at the job. I know I am. But I was presenting a level of work that wasn't mine and letting that define my standing here, and that wasn't fair to you or honest about me." I sat with that for a moment. The thing about a genuine acknowledgement, not a defensive explanation, not a partial admission hedged with justifications, but an actual reckoning, is that it requires a specific response. Not absolution necessarily, but something that honors the effort it took to say the thing clearly. "I appreciate you saying this," I said. "And I want to be direct with you. Your instincts on client communication are genuinely strong. Your relationship skills are real. Those are valuable things. What wasn't working was the structure that put other people's analytical work in your hands to present as undifferentiated team output." He nodded. "Under the new structure," I said, "work will be attributed. Which means your actual strengths will be visible on their own terms. That's better for you, not worse." He looked up. Something in his expression shifted, the defensive preparation he'd carried into the room releasing slightly. "You're keeping me on. The contribution audit will determine your compensation adjustment," I said. "But yes, you're good at parts of this job that the company genuinely needs. What it needed was a structure that stopped requiring you to carry work that wasn't yours." He stood up, extended his hand. "Thank you." I shook it. "Come see me Friday. I want to talk about the Henderson account. I think your client relationship skills are being underutilized there." He left. I picked up my pen and went back to the operational review. I don't tell you that story to demonstrate generosity. I tell it because it illustrates something I had thought carefully about during the 14 months of building toward this moment. That the goal was never to dismantle individuals. The goal was to dismantle a structure. Structures shape behavior. Change the structure and you change what behavior is incentivized, what becomes possible, what stops being necessary. Brandon hadn't been the architect of the problem. He'd been one of its products. So had I, in a different way. The contribution audit Gerald and I had promised took 53 days to complete rather than 60. Gerald ran it with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 4 years watching accurate records be obscured and was now able to apply his precision to the actual truth of things. The results were not surprising to me. They were, I think, surprising to several people who had not previously seen their own contribution mapped in documented form. Deja's adjustments were the largest. 5 years of work that had been consistently undercompensated relative to its demonstrable impact on client retention and revenue. The number Gerald presented to me in his summary document sat on the page with the quiet weight of something that should have been obvious years ago. Carol's adjustment was significant. Raymond's was considerable. There were 14 people across the organization whose compensation was corrected upward in that first round. I presented the results to the affected employees individually in private meetings with Gerald present. Not in a group announcement, not in a memo. One at a time with the full documentation visible so each person could see the specific basis for the correction rather than receiving a number without context. Carol sat across from me with Gerald's audit summary in her hands and read through it slowly. Twice. When she looked up, her eyes were bright but her voice was steady. "This goes back 4 years," she said. "Yes. You're correcting 4 years. Where the audit identified sustained contribution that wasn't reflected in compensation, yes. The correction accounts for the full period." She set the document down carefully on the edge of my desk. Straightened it. Looked at it for a moment. "I thought about leaving," she said. "Twice. Seriously, with job applications submitted. And both times I stayed." Because she paused. "I don't know exactly why I stayed. Inertia maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to believe it was actually as bad as it felt." "I'm glad you stayed," I said honestly. "The company needed you more than it knew." She looked at me with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to say something they've been carrying for a while. "The thing about being infrastructure," she said, "is that you start to believe it yourself. After a certain number of years. You start to think, maybe this is just what I am. Maybe the ceiling is real." "It wasn't real," I said. "It was imposed. I know that now." She picked up the document again. "I knew it then underneath. But knowing it underneath and having something in your hands that proves it are different things." She was right about that. I had known it underneath for 6 years. The audit was proof, but the knowing had always been there. Quiet, persistent, refusing to be fully talked out of itself even during the periods when the structural dismissal had been most relentless. The trick had been learning to build from the knowing rather than waiting for the proof. Patricia Osei flew to Atlanta 4 weeks after the transition announcement. Not for a formal client meeting. She called me on a Tuesday and said she'd be in Atlanta for a board meeting on Thursday and wanted to have lunch if I was available. The kind of direct, unmediated scheduling that had not been possible when every interaction with Meridian ran through Marcus's account management layer. We ate at a restaurant 3 blocks from the office. The kind of place with good light and enough ambient noise to make a conversation private without effort. She was in her early 50s, precise and warm in equal measure, with the specific quality of attention that comes from years of being the most prepared person in any room and having learned to wear that preparation lightly. She told me about the first time she'd noticed my analytical voice in Callaway's deliverables. A scenario modeling document from 3.5 years ago. The assumptions were structured in a way she hadn't seen from a consulting firm before. A specific approach to uncertainty quantification that she had only encountered previously in academic literature. I asked Marcus who had built the model, she said. He said it was a team effort led by his senior analysts. That was his standard answer, I said. I know, she said. Which is why I started asking differently. Not who built it, but who I should speak to if I had technical questions about the methodology. A slight smile. He gave me 3 names. None of them were yours. What did you do? I sent technical questions to all 3 of them, she said. The responses I got told me everything. 2 of them couldn't answer at the level the model required. The 3rd gave me a perfectly competent response, but the language was different from the document. Wrong voice. So you called Deja? So I called Deja, she confirmed. And Deja, to her credit, was honest with me. We ate for a moment in comfortable quiet. What I want to tell you, Patricia said, setting down her fork, is that the reason Meridian has stayed with Callaway for 9 years, despite more competitive offers from 3 other firms in that period, is the quality of the analytical work. That's it. Not the relationship management. Not the account service. The work. She looked at me directly. Which means Meridian has been staying for you for at least 4 years without either of us having a direct conversation about it. That's changing, I said. It's changed, she corrected. Past tense. As of the restructured engagement agreement your team sent me last week. She picked up her water glass. I want to say something that might sound strange. Go ahead. I'm glad it took as long as it did. I looked at her. Not because the situation was acceptable, she said quickly. It wasn't. What Marcus built there wasn't acceptable, and the fact that it persisted as long as it did reflects a failure I include myself in, because I had enough information earlier to push harder for direct engagement and I didn't push hard enough. Then why glad? Because she said, the company you've built in 14 months, the acquisition structure, the financing, the transition plan, that required the complete operational knowledge you spent 6 years accumulating. If you'd been promoted at year 2, you would have moved into a management role and out of the analytical depth that made the acquisition possible. Pause. The thing that was used to keep you small was also the thing that built your advantage. That's not justice. But it is interesting. I sat with that for a long moment. He was right. And it was the version of the truth I had been least willing to examine directly. That the specific injustice of my situation had also been the specific condition that made what I'd built possible. 6 years of being left alone to do the actual work because the actual work was considered beneath the notice of the people who cared about visibility. 6 years of accumulating the operational knowledge that no one thought to protect because no one thought I was a threat. The underestimation had been the opening. I had walked through it slowly, quietly, and with complete attention. And the building on the other side was mine. I want to stop here for a moment before I let you go. Because I've been telling you a story about an acquisition and a mop and a Monday morning letter. About 14 months of disciplined preparation and a building full of people whose work had been quietly misattributed for years. About a man who handed me a cleaning implement on a Friday without knowing what was sitting in an envelope on his desk. All of that happened. Every detail is true. But underneath the logistics of it, underneath the financing structures and the due diligence rounds and the coalition of allies who made the thing possible, the story I was really telling you is much simpler. It's about what you do with being underestimated. And I want to talk about that directly because I think it's the part of this story that actually belongs to you. There is a specific kind of professional experience that doesn't get discussed honestly very often. Not because it's rare, it's extraordinarily common. But because the people it happens to are frequently made to feel that naming it is itself a form of weakness. That the appropriate response is to work harder, prove more, wait longer, demonstrate again what has already been demonstrated, and trust that eventually the right people will notice. That advice is not entirely wrong. Working hard matters. Building genuine capability matters. Accumulating real knowledge matters. But the advice is incomplete in a way that costs people years. Because the people doing the underestimating are not, in most cases, sitting on the edge of recognition waiting to be convinced by one more excellent piece of work. They have made a structural decision, often unconscious, often not malicious in any deliberate sense, about who belongs in which category. And once that decision is made, evidence to the contrary gets absorbed into the existing framework rather than disrupting it. This is what happened with the Meridian analysis. 67 pages of exceptional work, presented by Marcus to a sophisticated client, received as confirmation of Marcus's team's capability. Not as evidence that the analyst who built it deserved a different category. The excellence was real. The attribution was absent. And the system continued. One more excellent piece of work was not going to change that. What changed it was something different entirely. I want to tell you the thing I wish someone had told me at year 2 instead of year 6. The skills you are building inside a system that undervalues you are not being wasted. They are being stored. Every piece of work you produce that goes uncredited is work you understand completely. Every system you learn, every client relationship you sustain from the background, every operational process you master while someone else takes the meeting. All of it is knowledge that belongs to you in a way it can never fully belong to the person whose name is on the presentation. The person whose name is on the presentation knows the surface. You know the structure. And structure is what everything is actually built on. Marcus could present the meridian analysis because I had built it. He could not have built it himself. Which meant that the analytical capability Meridian was paying for resided entirely with me regardless of whose name appeared in the meeting room. Patricia Osei understood that. It's why she went looking for the source. The presentation was the visible thing. The architecture beneath it was the real thing. The invisible work is real work. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. But here is the second part, and this is the part that is harder to hear. Storing knowledge is necessary but not sufficient. I spent 6 years building an extraordinary understanding of that company. And if I had continued spending the next 6 years building understanding without asking the larger question, the question of what I was going to do with it, the understanding would have remained exactly as invisible as everything else. The acquisition wasn't built from the knowledge alone. It was built from the decision to treat the knowledge as capital. To ask, what can this become? Not, when will someone notice what I have? But, what am I able to build with what I know? That shift, from waiting to be recognized to deciding to act, is the most important move in the story. And it is entirely internal. Nobody handed it to me. No mentor arrived with a roadmap. No door opened from the outside. I was sitting at my desk on a November evening, running a market analysis that had nothing to do with my assigned work, and I looked at publicly available information about my own company and asked a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. What if I bought it? Not as a fantasy. As a serious question deserving a serious answer. That question led to a phone call with Simone, which led to a financing conversation, which led to 17 conversations with lenders, which led to Gerald Park, which led to David Okafor's Tuesday morning response, which led to a Thursday closing and a Monday letter and a mop I cleaned a bathroom with while knowing exactly what was waiting upstairs. The whole chain began with one serious question asked in private on a November evening. I don't know what your version of that question is. I don't know what you're building or what industry you're in or what specific form of underestimation you've been navigating. But I believe with complete conviction that most people who have been doing invisible work for long enough have a version of that question available to them if they're willing to ask it seriously. What can this become? Not someday. Not in theory. Right now, with what you actually know, with what you've actually built, with the specific understanding you've accumulated while being left alone to do the actual work. What can this become? I also want to say something to a different person. The person who isn't currently doing invisible work. Or who is, but who recognizes themselves in Marcus rather than in Celeste. Because Marcus was not a monster. I want to be honest about that too. He was a man who had built his professional identity around a particular understanding of what capability looked like and who it belonged to. That understanding was wrong. Its consequences were real and they compounded across years and affected multiple people whose careers were diminished by the structure he maintained. That is not a small thing and I am not minimizing it. But I also don't think Marcus woke up each morning and deliberately chose cruelty. I think he woke up each morning inside a framework that felt natural and self-evident to him and moved through the day making decisions that framework dictated without examining the framework itself. The examining is the work. The willingness to ask, who is actually doing the things that matter here and does our structure reflect that accurately? That is the work that most organizations avoid because it's uncomfortable and because the people most incentivized to do it are frequently the people the examination would displace. If you are in a position where you shape opportunities for other people, where you decide whose work gets attributed, whose name goes on the presentation, whose promotion application gets serious consideration and whose gets quietly tabled, I am asking you to do that examination. Not because it's morally required, though it is. But because the person you are underestimating may be building something you don't know about yet. And one Monday morning the letter will arrive. Here is where I want to end. 6 months after the acquisition closed, I walked into the executive bathroom on the 4th floor with fresh hand towels and restocked the supplies myself. Not because it needed doing urgently. Not because I was making a point. Because I was doing a walkthrough of the building, Something I did every few weeks, every floor, every room, the owner's version of knowing your own house. And the supplies needed restocking and I was there and it took 4 minutes. Deja found me on my way out. She looked at the supplies in my hand. Then at me. Then back at the supplies. Really? He said. The paper towels were almost out, I said. She shook her head slowly. Then she smiled. You know, most owners don't personally restock the executive bathroom. Most owners, I said, don't know where the supply closet is. Do you know where all the supply closets are? 3rd floor, east corridor next to the server room, I said. 2nd floor, behind the copy station. 1st floor, under the reception desk in the left cabinet. I paused. And this floor at the end of the hall past Gerald's office. She looked at me for a long moment. 6 years of being infrastructure, she said quietly. 6 years of learning the building, I said. She nodded. Something in her expression, not for the first time, contained the particular warmth of someone who has worked beside you long enough to understand what the sentences underneath your sentences mean. Come on, she said. Gerald's waiting for us. I put the remaining supplies back in the closet, closed the door, and walked down the hallway of the building I owned toward the meeting where the work continued. The Atlanta skyline was doing its late afternoon thing outside the windows. Gold light on glass, the city moving through its ordinary rhythms, completely indifferent to the particular history of this particular floor. I didn't need it to notice. I didn't need any of it to notice. The work was the point. It always had been. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the person doing the invisible work? The one whose name wasn't on the presentation, whose promotion disappeared into a review process that never concluded, whose capability was absorbed into someone else's credit without comment or acknowledgement. Tell me about it in the comments. Not because I need the engagement metric, because that experience is one of the most isolating professional realities there is, and the simple act of naming it out loud in a space where other people are naming it too matters. You are not imagining it. The work was real. The invisibility was imposed. Those are separate things and it is important to keep them separate. And if you are currently in the middle of it, if you are 6 months in or 2 years in or like me 6 years in, I want to ask you the question I wish someone had asked me earlier. What can your knowledge become? Not eventually. Not in theory. Right now. Sit with it seriously. Because the answer may surprise you. And the chain that starts with a serious question asked in private on an ordinary evening can end somewhere nobody in your current building has thought to look. One more thing before you go. The mop story has traveled further than I expected since I first told it. People send me versions of it. Their own mop moments. The specific small indignity that arrived after years of larger ones, that crystallized something they'd been building toward without fully naming. What I've noticed in all of those versions is the same thing. The mop moment is never actually about the mop. It's about the clarity that arrives when someone's assumption about you becomes so complete, so settled, so entirely disconnected from the reality of what you've built, that it stops being painful and becomes information. Marcus handing me that mop on a Friday told me something precise and useful about the distance between his model of the world and the actual world. And that distance, clearly measured, was the last piece of data I needed. The cleaning was beside the point. The clarity was everything. If you have a mop moment, if you've had one or you're in the middle of one right now, I want you to write it in the comments. What was the moment that made the gap between their assumption and your reality completely, finally, undeniably visible? I read everything. Every comment. Not as a content strategy but because these stories are real and they belong to real people and they deserve to be received by someone who understands exactly what it costs to live them. Drop your story below. And if this resonated, if any part of it felt like something you needed to hear today, share it with the person in your life who is doing invisible work right now and doesn't yet know what it can become. They need to hear it more than you do. There are more stories in the description below. Each one is different. Each one is true. Each one is about someone who was told in some form that they were infrastructure. And each one is about what they built when they finally decided to treat what they knew as what it actually was. Capital. Thank you for staying until the end. The work was always worth doing. It still is.